Namaste. Welcome to Bharat Voice. Today we will discuss why do we need need for new Indology in academics. So we have with us very reputed guests to discuss this important topic. We have with us Dr. Koenraad Elst, and who needs no introduction. He's an institution by himself. He's a world-renowned Orientalist and a social scientist. And an Indologist too. And we all know about his well-published out of India theory against the Aryan invasion theory that he had put up. So we have him with us to discuss about this topic. And we have with us Dr. Anjali Kanojia too. So now why are we even discussing this topic? So why do we need a new Indology in academia and its related paradigm shift from Western lens to Indocentric point of view or a Indocentric scholarship in Indology. So, because we have seen Indology then earlier being taken up from the beginning by the Westerners and the distortions that came along with it about India or the notion of India, anything and everything related to India, be it Dharma or anything, our society or and everything else. So these distortions have to be sort of nullified, or rather it is for Indians or Hindus to speak for themselves what is Indology, or rather what are we. It is important. This is part of our dharmic studies. We have been always through centuries, through thousands of years, being looking inwards and doing swadhyay or swaparikshan. So we start now. I'll begin this particular discussion with just welcome Dr. Koenraad Elst, welcome Dr. Anjali Kanojia to discuss why do we need new Indology in academics. And of course, Dr. Koenraad Elst is very well known. As I said, he needs no introduction. He's an institution by himself. And for the viewers, Dr. Anjali Kanojia is a political scientist and has spent years as a public servant and in higher education. She is passionate about cultivating next generation and thus the Indology initiatives. She's part of a very good initiative called the Indology Academy. So she's a main editor of Indology Academy. Welcome to you, Dr. Anjali Kanojia, for this important discussion. Dr. Koenraad Elst, I would like to begin with you. Why did Indology start? And did it start with an agenda in the first place?
Right. Well, it very much started with an agenda. You could say the whole field of Orientalism started in the 13th century with the study of Arabic, because Arabic was the language of the enemy, so to speak, for Christian Europe. And so you had first Raimundus Lulus from Catalonia, who also tried to convert Muslims. Somewhat later, you have from my area Koenraad, who actually went to preach in Morocco Christianity. He came away with his life, but not much more, and he died soon after because of the wounds that Muslims had inflicted on him. Okay, so that was the initial atmosphere, and gradually the church started investing in the study of Arabic and of the Oriental Christian languages like Coptic, Armenian, Georgian, Aramaic, and so on, as a sort of diplomatic channel to the churches that were under the heel of Islam. And so that was church diplomacy. And indeed, the university where I studied, Leuven University, was one of the main centers for this church effort. Then, as the real Eastern world opened up, then departments for studying India, China, and so on also came up. The first Indologist and Iranologist uh, was probably the Frenchman Abraham Hyacinthe Anquetil Duperron in the late 18th century. It is he who made a translation from the Persian translation of the Upanishads, so not from the original, but as you know, Prince Dara Shikoh, perhaps other Muslims also had made a Persian translation of the Upanishads, and that was translated then into Latin, French, and so on. That's probably the start of Indology. And then around 1800, soon some important works from India were translated, like the Bhagavad Gita, Shakuntala, the Manusmriti, of course, because that was used by the British to codify Hindu law in India. So all of that had an agenda initially. Then, as Indian writings became known, some people in Europe became genuinely enthusiastic for them. This you can illustrate perhaps the best with the discovery of Indo-European. The Indo-European language family, of course, gave a certain importance to India for Europe, which China or Japan or Arabia did not have. Namely, it connected Europe with India. And so it was discovered by a French Jesuit living in India. And he very much had an agenda. He describes what a joy he felt when he saw a Hindu temple being demolished.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, he was a missionary. It's pretty clear where he stands. Yet his paper, in which he actually starts the whole science of Indo-European studies, there's nothing wrong with that. It just describes a number of linguistic phenomena that are similar in Sanskrit as they are in Greek or Latin. So there's nothing wrong with that. You should separate these two. The first man to make these findings known in Europe was the freethinker Voltaire around 1770. He said that, or he concluded from this linguistic link, that the source of European culture lay on the banks of the Ganga.
Mm-hmm.
Now that too, that too had an agenda. You see, it was interesting and partly correct, but it had an agenda in his case. You see, he was very much against the church, and so
Mm-hmm.
he used this to prove that the origin of European culture is not in the Bible. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it, he used India to depreciate the Christian component. And so many of them are going to do that. Um, but so you have a very important strand in Europe of people who idealize India, who are fond of India. Like Friedrich Schlegel in 1808, he writes this book, um, Language and Wisdom of the Indians. And of course, he's a believer in the out of India theory, like many in the early period. Uh, so at that time, you see, there was not yet an attitude of looking down on India. India
Mm-hmm.
had not been colonized yet. It was still an independent trading partner. And it was big and it was far away. People didn't know much about it, except that enormous riches came from there, namely spices and jewels. So India had a very good press at the time. And also, of course, it seemed to be more tolerant and far-sighted and so on than Christianity, at least for those people who were at the time growing away from Christianity. But so many of them had an agenda, but often a different one from what you would expect. Like in the Aryan invasion debate, all the time I hear Indians say, oh, they're racist, colonialists, and so on. But no, you see, first of all, I mentioned a number of Europeans who were very enthusiastic for India. I will give you the case of a real colonialist, an out and out colonialist who sided with India. This was Mount Stuart Elphinstone, who in the 1830s had been the governor of Bombay. And so after his retirement, he wrote a history of India, in which he strongly defends the Indian origin of the Indo-European languages.
Mm-hmm.
So, what was more important here was the fact that he was in India. Unlike the scholars in Europe who started Indology, indeed, who started founding departments of Indology in the universities, like Franz Bopp in Berlin. And so, unlike them, you see, he, being in India, understood the magnitude and the importance of India. If you look at India on a world map in the Mercator projection, which was the usual one, India is very small. It's smaller than Scandinavia, whereas in reality it is bigger than Europe. Okay, so you see, people who are not exposed to the reality of India may think India is some peripheral little thing on the side of the map. And so whatever people's, whatever their ideological bias may be. And so the reverse, also happens. It also, you know, is a phenomenon that sometimes goes in favor of India with people, you see, in favor of the colonial project or so, but nevertheless also in favor of Indian culture. Okay. Now, there are different phases when India gets idealized. In the 19th century, you have the American transcendentalists, for example. There was also a pro-Hindu movement. Then in the 60s, 70s, you get this hippie movement, Hare Krishnas going to the West and so on. And so there is a memory of that, and you see the influence in a number of Hindu nationalist websites where they quote all these people who are praising India, and somehow they don't seem to notice that all these people are located rather far in the past. In the last decades, you don't have such statements anymore about India being the mother of all cultures and sciences and so on. No, 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 no. You see, the last decades, you get a strong anti-India bias, and especially anti-Hindu bias. I mean, India is just a piece of geography, but as the mother of the Hindu civilization, now that is problematic. And so you get a very strong anti uh, anti-Hindu bias, and that greatly colors all scholarly works about it. And so, not just in online discussions or so, but even in scholarly works, in peer-reviewed papers, and so on, you do see the traces of this bias all over. Okay, we'll return to that, but now let's hear Anjali.
Anjali, Dr. Anjali, you have in your paper about Indology, in your introductory paper, you've proposed indicism. Now, what is this indicism about? Is it any other ism to begin with, or is it something new? Can you please speak about it? Or is it something that we already have and we are just looking at it again?
So thank you again for this opportunity. It is something that we have. So Indicism, right? Indology, study of India for various purposes. Some were, positive reasons, some very negative reasons, especially of late, as Dr. Elst mentioned. And you kind of mentioned this earlier in your introduction, swaparikshan, right? But using the Sanskrit term, I at this point in time, I don't think it was feasible exactly. People know what Indology already is. So trying to capture what Indology is and utilizing that instead of coming up with yet another term, which is a non-English term, I think, is the reason why I stuck with Indicism. And I know there are many debates revolving around the isms, like why is Hinduism an ism versus the other two major religions don't have an ism at the end. And I'm aware of all of this, but we're trying to work within the scope and the grounds that are already laid out in academia. So what is Indicism? Again, Swaparikshan, looking at our own ways, cultures, societies, rituals, academics, government, policymaking, looking at these things from our lens. And I'll give you a silly example. I sometimes use this in, in super introductory yoga classes. It's like when you want to see yourself, do you look at the mirror in your own house? Do you dust off the dust and the Maya and look at it within your own house, or do you go to another continent, a neighbor's house, to look at yourself in the mirror, right? So this is kind of where the idea came from, about kind of grabbing this and utilizing it for our own purposes.
Yeah, I think that was a good answer, because we need to first use their own terminologies to sort of begin the studies from our own lens, and in due course of time to revive our languages, because even our languages are dying, as Dr. Else has been telling before too. So, Dr. Else, your views on this? Our language is dying, and our language being the main course of Indology. I mean, this main debate on Indology.
Yes, I am. I'm not sure that this is because of the Westerners, or at least the scholarly study of India at the moment. I mean, in China, for example, they don't have that problem. There is no infringement by English on Chinese. There's no particular tendency to take over English words into Chinese. They systematically translate all new concepts into proper Chinese. Um, and so in India, the influx of English is much larger, mainly because of decisions made by Indians. So, I mean, the history that the British were here, and that they used English in India, and that they made Indians familiar with English, that's a historical fact you can't revoke. But then after 1947, what have the Indians done? You see, the Constituent Assembly had a vote on this, and which would be the official language. And so 50% voted for Shuddh Hindi, 50% for Sanskrit, and unfortunately, the stalemate was broken by the vote cast by the chairman, Rajendra Prasad, which was in favor of Hindi, which I think is a black day for India, because Hindi never had a chance. And it was very sure that all the non-Hindi speakers would protest against Hindi being there, and it would never grow fully. Whereas Sanskrit had always had this status within India. You see, it was nobody's personal language, but it was the language of culture, and this was everybody. This was accepted by everybody. So anyway, the point that I want to make now here is that 0 people voted in favor of English. You see, for the generation that had achieved independence, it was totally obvious that a post-colonial state would abolish the colonial language. And so they voted to do that by 1965. That's still what the Constitution says. But then the Nehruvian lobby, using, of course, the Tamil lobby and so on, to gather some steam against this, managed in 1965 a sort of presidential decree to block the implementation of the Constitution and to keep English in place. So that's the situation today. I dare say that quite a few people who do Indology in Western universities would be sympathetic to a complete Sanskritization or something, some indigenous solution to the language problem in India. They're not per se against it. It's mostly these, political scientists and so on who are strongly anti-Hindu. They, of course, associate Sanskrit with Hinduism, and they are strongly against it. But so anyway, you see, their opinion doesn't matter. It's the opinion of the Indians that matters, and there, unfortunately, again, they are not doing the needful, at least not from the Indian viewpoint. Like you have this national educational policy the last few years. It makes a few token, gestures towards the vernaculars, but it leaves the power position of English untouched. So that's going to continue. Many parents, poor parents, unschooled parents, want a better life for their children, and they will continue to want that they learn English. And so English will become more and more the language of public affairs in India for a larger and larger part of the population. And India will simply become a part of the Anglosphere unless something happens. And I tend to be optimistic in the sense that I believe that sudden sudden changes do happen, sudden turns. So I think this is still possible, but nevertheless, at the moment, it's not going in the right direction. But I don't think that the role played by Indology as such in this respect is that important.
Okay. Uh, uh, Dr. Kanojia,
Mhm.
Anjali, I would like to ask you about the education policy in India and US and with respect to Indology. Can you please? And shouldn't Indology studies be started in India too?
So three great questions, and as Dr. Elts pointed out, initially, Indology was not a negative thing per se towards India or the Hindus, right? It's like scholars trying to study what is working for a very ancient civilization and trying to take the good and perhaps apply it to their own civilization. So um, did not always start out as a bad thing. Indology studies per se, I mean, I'll just kind of stick to the national education policy. It came out a couple of years ago, been through a couple of iterations. And I have been quite a critic, and in a good way, because I want to see some good things. Yes, there have been some changes regarding how a language ought to be studied or how languages will be reintroduced, but none of that is kind of seen as in terms of empowerment, right? So there are some issues with there are some larger issues with what types of subjects will be studied or which universities from the Western world will come and teach certain topics.
Yes,
For example, the arts
yes.
and the social sciences, there's no need for external universities to
Mhm.
set up shop in India, one of the most ancient places on earth that has a living culture. There's no need, in my opinion, for others to teach us the history of Bharatnatyam or why we do things that we do, right? So there are definitely some major issues with the national education policy. As far as the academics in the US go, we know that, I mean, everyone, even within academia, maybe they're not so vocal about it, but it's a very ancient system. And I am hopeful in the sense that this particular pandemic has brought about a huge change. Those 4-year typical degree plans that everyone just kind of blindly followed, all of that is just students are realizing, so the public, the consumers are realizing that this doesn't necessarily generate jobs. I personally have seen students still working 2 or 3 jobs. That typical 8 to 5 job that is also diminishing in many of the fields. So I think the market demand is going to force education to change. Places like Google and these other large companies have their own kind of programs and plans that they want students to go through so they can be employed. So as much as I love things like art history and whatnot, those classes that used to be like 200, 300 students, all of that is now just ancient history because of the pandemic and whatnot. The need, right? I mean, this education is market driven. So we have empty classrooms. We see top heavy administration. more administration and professors than students. I mean, this is not going to work. In a way, here's an upheaval. Here's, you know, so far it was incremental change. Here now there's a punctuation, and the pandemic is forcing colleges and universities to relook at themselves. Pulling GRE scores and standardized tests and whatnot to get people in is not, I think, a viable solution. And as a policymaker, I'll even point out that these student loans have contributed a lot to education just kind of not being at an optimum. So that's a little bit about India and a little bit about the US.
Yeah, I think that is a very important point that you made. And most importantly, I feel the new Indology paradigm that you are looking at, what is the definition of Hindu that you would like to take? Because it's a very important aspect, because from that would start, uh, it's important because Hindu is very much a center of Indology. You cannot, Indology is what's, I mean, it is Swadhyaya, right? It is studying of India. Bharat is nothing but a study of Hinduism is what you begin with, and its culture, tradition, so many other aspects, social structure, and everything. So, what is the definition of Hindu that you're looking at?
So, from an Indicism perspective, right? I mean, we're looking at Indicism. There are different theories that go under the Indicism umbrella. So, this ism is a way to academically examine things. So, you kind of asking me to look at the term Hindu or the living culture that is the Hinduism from this Indicism lens. It's brilliant. I mean, this is actually something that we're hoping to see more papers received on, right? So kind of, again, I'm not a religious studies scholar, but I will give you a little bit about how you would look at this term from an Indicism lens, framework,
Yes.
perspective,
Yes.
paradigm, right? Here, within this paradigm, the native voice, which has been either suppressed or oppressed or ignored, even by Indian scholars and academics and policymakers, this would come into play again, right? That is one way to kind of bring this to the fore. So what is Hindu? Of course, it's a geography. Uh, and of course, it's a set of living practices embedded, thanks to Agastya Muni, right? Embedded in everything that we do, how we wake up, how we look at the sun, how we drink water, how we eat, right? How we practice everything. Everything in life is embedded in a certain way for this living, breathing, practicing culture. So how does Indicism view Hindu? Well, something that is, again, indigenous, something that spans the Indian subcontinent, right? I mean, not the outside influences are semi-recent if we look at history from a macro perspective. So what used to be, what people really wanted to aspire and come and study, right? What has led the world? And again, I want to bring the 6 darshanas into play here. The way to look at the self using the existing literature and tools and instruments, which again, the darshanas, is what I see as Indicism. So it's not a darshana. I mean, we're not looking for any kind of, moksha enlightenment. But from an academic perspective, it's looking at yourself from your own way of being and lens, which is already there. I mean, this is not anything new. I think we're just kind of forgotten about it. So you can say, yes, this is a new way of decolonizing, or this or that. People can use different terms for it, but basically, this is the essence.
I think that was very insightful, and I'm sure you'd be working on this area of research. Your academy would be. Dr. Els, uh, Dr. Els, you have given very seminal work or research on prophetism and negationism. So, how is Hindu Dharma, from an Indology also point of view, different from prophetism and that kind of culture and society? Oh, sorry, one second.
You can hear me?
Yeah, I can hear
Yes.
you.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So let me first say something about this word Indic. You see, the word Hindu has a very negative connotation these days. It was not like that 50 years ago. Today it's very much like that. And so you see all the rats leaving a sinking ship. And so you have the Sikhs and the Ramakrishna Mission and the Veera Shaivas and so on all saying, oh, we are not Hindus, you know, even
Hmm.
though by the definition of the constitution they are Hindus and they fall under Hindu law. But you see, any which way, they don't want to be known as Hindus. And we find this even among Hindu activists themselves. And I don't mean the RSS, who now always say that, you know, every Indian is a Hindu and we're not Hindu, we're Indian and so on. No, no, even subtle Hindu activists who know what they're doing, who understand their thing, yet you see they prefer another word which more or less means Hindu, but it's not the
Sense.
word Hindu, namely Indic. Like, for instance, a few years ago, this Hari Kiran Vadlamani founded a very meritorious center of Hindu research called Indic Academy. And so the word Indic now serves as a sort of euphemism, a better sounding alternative for Hindu. Now, be careful because before too long, the enemy is going to know that and it's going to blacken Indic the way he did with Hindu. Um, anyway, I mean, this is where we are. The definition of Hindu, of course, I think is extremely simple. You just take the historical definition. Originally, it was a Persian word meaning Indian, geographical term. Is the equivalent in Persian of Sindhu in Sanskrit. So it means inhabitants of the Sindhu River Valley or beyond, looked at from Persia. But when the term was brought into India by the Muslim invaders, it at once acquired a religious dimension also. And so it meant a non Muslim who is an Indian. So if a non-Muslim is Spanish or African or something, there's other terms for that. But if the kafir, if the unbeliever is an Indian, then he's a Hindu. And so
Hmm.
from the beginning, the word Hindu did not mean Indian Muslim or did not include Indian Muslim. And then it was sort of sophisticated. It also did not include Indian Christian. But so at any rate, it had a communal dimension. And in that sense, it is understandable that people try to avoid the word Hindu. Uh, okay, well, that's where we are. I mean, I have my opinion about it. And in fact, a very well, it's not just an opinion. I mean, here I'm very sure of my case. But okay, I mean, I know at the moment the word Hindu is very difficult. Many people try to avoid it. Okay, now, how is Hindu Dharma different from the prophetic monotheistic religions? Well, the prophetic monotheistic religions have a specific doctrine. If you don't believe that Muhammad received the Quran, then you're not a Muslim. If you don't believe in Jesus' resurrection, you're not a Christian. So in Hinduism, you don't have that defining belief. I mean, if you don't believe in monism, in the fact that everything is one, that the Atma and the Brahma are one, then you're not a Vedanti. You see, you have sampradayas within Hinduism that do have a specific doctrine. But Hinduism as a whole is an umbrella term. It has no defining thought system. Not even those that are most widespread, like belief in reincarnation, no, that's not the definition of Hinduism. You see in the Chandogya Upanishad, this fellow coming home and being asked by his friend, hey, what happens after death? And he
Hmm.
doesn't
Yes.
know. Yet by any reasonable definition, he's a Hindu. Okay, but he doesn't have the notion of reincarnation yet. He has the notion of Vedanta, of Atman, and so on. That's part of his training from which he comes home. He's a PhD in
Hmm.
Atmavada, but he has no reincarnation. Okay, so even that isn't part of a definition of Hinduism. During the British period, some people tried to imitate Christianity by enumerating a set of beliefs that Hindus have, like Bala Gangadhara Tilak tried it. But you see, that's the wrong approach, and that does injustice to Hinduism. You do not have that compelling belief in Hinduism. So that's the main difference. Now, from that follows a practical difference, namely that Hinduism is a lot more tolerant or pluralistic. It's intrinsically pluralistic. It accepts different viewpoints. And so what follows from that is that when it gets to deal with new viewpoints, foreign viewpoints, like the Moplas coming into Kerala or the Syrian Christians coming in or so, they don't ask questions. They don't say, okay, you're building this church. What are you doing there? What are you teaching there? There are no questions asked. They said, okay, you can live here, you can build here your temple or whatever you call it, and do your thing as long as you don't slaughter cows or something. We don't mind what you're doing. And so there is a sort of tolerance that is not reciprocated. And so there's the historical fact that Christianity and Islam have a far more gruesome record of intolerance than Hinduism ever had.
That's very true, Dr. S. And then we also suffer from this negationism, as you put forward a theory, where we deny these invasions. We almost revere our own. The Stockholm syndrome is deep within us. So, can you please speak about that too? Enlighten
Yeah,
us.
well, the obvious reason for this is that certain forces, namely Muslims and Christians themselves, and Nehruvians, try to downplay this painful part of history, thinking that that way they can make Islam or Christianity more acceptable, as if anything that we know about the past necessarily conditions what we do in the present. Um, but there's also something in Hinduism that helps making this possible. You see, as I just said, Hindus don't ask what is happening inside these mosques. Of course, when then they get to face the result, the result of what they learn in those mosques, namely the partition massacres and the Bangladesh massacres and so on, then of course they're up in arms and that they don't want. But they don't make the link with their religious doctrine. So, and that's part of the Hindu psyche. You see, naturally they tend to accept all religions and not to make the link between these religious doctrines and what is being done in practice. So it takes a little intellectual effort, which few people in India have done. So you get people who really criticize Islam, like Dr. Ambedkar, a few people know. Then you have especially Sitaram Goel. Meanwhile, you've had other people doing similar work in other parts of the world. Now, today, with the internet, with globalization, all this critical information of Islam is readily available. 30 years ago, a book by Ram Swarup about the Hadith was still banned in India. Today, well, they may ban any book they want. You see, just a mouse click and you have all the information. So this is spreading greatly, and you have the first very beneficial, very desirable effect, which is that within the Muslim world itself, you have more and more Muslims quitting Islam. And
Absolutely.
I see happening in Arab countries exactly the same what I've seen happening in my own country during my own lifetime. So around, let's say, 1970, you saw, my country was a very Catholic country. You saw a big walk out of the church. And today, many churches are not used anymore, or are used as restaurants or swimming pools or concert halls, that especially, because they're more or less made for that, or mosques. I don't know yet, in Belgium at least, of any church that has been turned into a Hindu temple. I understand there are a few in England. But so at any rate, this belief system can't hold. You see, people are not quitting Christianity because Christianity in the past has persecuted people and so on. They learn that in history books, but yeah, it doesn't make much difference. But what has made the difference is the democratization of knowledge. You see, people are not going to study everything about New Testament and so on, but they understand vaguely. You see, essentially, this is just a story. You see, there was a man, also not a man of very sound mind, who was an exorcist, which is Jesus. And so, anyway, he thought that he was the Messiah, although the Messiah is not supposed to die an ignominious death on the cross. And so they fantasized that he had been resurrected and so on. Now, you see, somehow, I mean, this is funny in human history that somehow some very questionable germ becomes a very big tree, and so this became a world religion. Jesus predicted that he was going to come back very soon, and he didn't. And so that mistaken prediction, that waiting in vain for the Savior who never comes, that was then transmuted into a religion. And look where it got. But nevertheless, it can't last forever. And so, as Lincoln said, you can't fool all the people all the time. So, many people who started understanding, yeah, this is not worth believing in. And so they have to remake their lives and find their ethics, especially elsewhere than in the Bible. So now I see the same thing happening in the Muslim world. Here and there, it's already making a difference. In most of the Arab countries, of course, it's under the radar. People don't go to public with it. And the country where I see very little of this is India. Because in India, the situation of polarization against the Hindus makes them very loyal to their community. It's like, you see, it's like in the middle of a battle, they are betraying their community. They don't want to do that. Although, in some places, especially where Muslims are very at ease, like in Kerala, there you do see an outspoken ex-Muslim movement. So that is all that is happening. So strictly speaking, from the viewpoint of Indology, this is all totally unimportant. I mean, they can describe that, they can notice that, they can research that, but essentially it makes no difference to them. You see, they describe facts. And
Yes.
so, but I mean, for us, it's important to see that background. And so, for uh, for the status of Hinduism, maybe that augurs well for the middle to distant future, when this present anti-Hindu animus is going to disappear. So I'm all in favor of Anjali's initiative. Yes, we need a new medium for Indology. At the same time, I think that the the motives that play today for starting this initiative, they are temporary, and unfortunately so. You see, I think the need to counter this anti-Hindu animus is going to lapse in a few decades. But
Yes.
okay, meanwhile, the work that we do today, hopefully very useful.
Dr. Else, I'll just go to Dr. Anjali, ask her the purpose behind the Indology Academy, and come back to you on what would you see as the dangers of new Indology.
Mhm.
Dr.
Um,
Anjali, on
yes.
the purpose of new Indology Academy. Can you
So the
please?
purpose of an Indology Academy, again, like I said, the seeds were there because there's a need, right? But a lot of academics, especially from India, who are also kind of being marginalized and left out. I'll just give you a concrete examples. For example, journal articles, submitting them to journals in the West and in India, things being rejected on ideological basis because journals don't want too many pro-Hindu things or too many pro Modi things, right? And of course, from a numbers point of view, if Modi happens to do well in terms of the economic sector, so be it. I mean, I'm not taking any sides whatsoever because I have my own issues with the present government in India. But when academics are being rejected for something that is ideological based and which is not scholarship based, which is not number based, right, which is not statistically based, I have heard way too many complaints and heartaches about that. So I was like, why don't we start something from this part of the world, where, of course, this is the land of freedom. I'm very grateful to be American in many different ways. Of course, I'm very grounded, I'd like to believe. But why not start something here that benefits Indians, Indian academics, Indian scholars? So the point of the academy kind of started out as bridging the gap between academics here and in India. I mean, these days, students are happily citing things that from YouTube videos, things like that. So I'm like, let's start webinars so that amazing academics from India get some type of a voice and become well known. Because all of this, even 20 years ago, would not be possible. But thanks to technology, I mean, if Indians can make gods out of anything, thanks to technology, Mata, I'm going to give technology a feminine head. Anyway, so thanks to technology, all this is possible. So thus started the initiatives of the Indology Academy, bridging that gap, and then of course the journal, the International Journal of Indology, is an initiative to just do exactly this, studying some of the things that are important, that are research-based, not just opinion pieces, right? That are research-based, giving that voice, giving that platform was much needed. So someone had to do the work. Why not us?
I think that's a very wonderful initiative of yours, because where you would be getting many researchers whose research is generally not taken up by the regular universities. So, this would be a good platform to have it vetted and have a kind of a peer review also on the
Absolutely.
research that is being put up. So it's a very good platform to start with. And as I said earlier, to look within is very important. It's time that we look at ourselves rather than others look at us. And Dr. Elst, I would like to come to you to ask about the dangers of new Indology, or what would you like to caution the new Indologists about, new
Mhm.
uh, Indologists about?
Yes. Well, don't underestimate the hostility you'll meet in the beginning. 4 years ago, also in Houston, Hindus had planned a conference, so also some new Indology type conference. Professor Lavanya
Yes,
Vimsani was involved. This Montreal-based Professor Arvind Sharma, a few more, and they have nothing to do, as far as I know, with any organized Hindu movement. Nevertheless, on the Indology list, which is a forum for all Indologists in the world, quite influential. Immediately, some American Indologists said, Hindutva. And so immediately, this project became unviable. The professors that had been announced withdrew, including some professors that were members of the list that announced to the list, herewith I withdraw my participation in this thing, and so on. So you don't have to be Hindutva to suffer, all the bias against Hindutva. And so this is what they're certainly now going to try to do with this Indology journal. Um, so to some extent, there's little you can do. I mean, they say what they want, even if they're liars. Well, they have a right to say it. But to a very important extent, you can, condition the whole situation yourself, namely by what you put into this journal. And so here, a mistake that you have to avoid is that now, from a Hindu viewpoint, anything goes. You see, you're going to get Hindus who say that the Mahabharata was 7,500 years ago, or that the Vedas have no history, they are revealed by the gods, or some stuff like that. And so the other side is sitting waiting, you see, they're going to check this first number and they're going to look for that kind of thing. They're going to see, oh yeah, this is Hindu superstition that is sold as scholarship. And so this is what you, in the first stage of the narrative, will have to very religiously avoid. And so here you have the, the whole question of Indology. Um, on the one hand, you have to be respectful of the facts, and on the other, you have to give more weight to the native perspective than Western Indologists have hitherto done. But you see, there's a lot that is said by natives that is rather less than scholarly. And so, some people on the Indian side are certainly going to elbow forward and say, you have to publish this because this is really Indian. Well, you still have to use your critical mind and sift, what is acceptable in a scholarly context and what is not. And so you have to really be doubly attentive to it because the enemy is looking over your shoulder.
Very good points. And yes, that has already happened. Some approaches like you must publish this, something by non-academics or some kind of ideological based, party based thing. And, that is not the place for this. There are plenty other forums and plenty other organizations. And the way this journal, of course, is set up, double blind review process, hopefully that will never get compromised. Of course, as editors, Priyanka and I will be looking over things, even VR Money is looking at things, but the nitty gritty will be hopefully, all these kind of issues will be resolved or solved by a truly academic peer review process. So thank you, Dr. Elton. I know I'm very familiar with what happened 4 or 5 years ago, being at the, far away, kind of looking at it. And academics were threatened with their jobs. And I just kind of see how people just, literally just distance themselves. And some literally just ran away because bread and butter, who wants to risk their jobs? That's why, so Gayatri, coming back to Indology, the purpose, starting something outside of academia so that the red tape and the bureaucracy and the maligning that comes with a typical academic institution viewing Indology a certain way, we simply don't have that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree with you. We really don't have anything viewing Indology with our own native perspective. We really don't have that. So this is a very great initiative and a very good initiative. Uh, uh, my best wishes for you for that. And then, Dr. Els, one more thing I would like to ask you is about how, as you said earlier, people do get cancelled out in academia, especially if you're not communist oriented and if you have uh, I mean, they have an anti-Hindu bias, to be in short, even if you're not a very, very, you can say, a very Hindutva, so-called Hindutva, although I feel is nothing but Hindu-ness, but still, if it goes that way. So, how do we counter this in academia? It happens even in the West and in India too. So, what do we do about this?
Yeah, well, it has to do with the exercise of power. And so far, Hindu activists have not been very good at playing that game. Um, I mentioned the march of secularism even within BHU. So you see, I myself have some experience. Um, 4 or 5 years ago, I spoke there for a few the philosophy department and the history department, and also for some student organization there. Now, last year I was back there. They have this BHU debating society. Something that wants to be something like the Oxford Union, and they had invited me, and then they disinvited me. Now, of course, I'm very used to being disinvited, but at BHU, that I had not expected. That I had really not expected. But so there, you had the same secularist stuff that you get at JNU and so on. So they used as an argument, for instance, yeah, but you are an activist, which I'm not. Well, okay, and so you are for the right what Arundhati Roy is for the rest, is for the left. So if we invite you, we ought to invite Arundhati Roy also. Well, I'm not against that. You see, let her come, let her discuss the out of India theory with me if she wants, if she feels up to it. But the effect is that the students who wanted to hear me were deprived of the opportunity. Now, incidentally, some other organization then invited me, and the whole event somehow essentially went through anyway. So the sphere at BHU is not that bad. But anyway, I mean, you see the onward march of political correctness, as they call it, even in India, even in the farthest corners. So what to do about it? Well, you see, once in a while, the woke crowd is going to come of it. Like lately, several sports associations in England, in Holland, and so on, have decided that trans women cannot trans men, or I don't know what they're called, transgenders, from men who declare themselves women. They can no longer participate in women's sports contests. You see, that's a defeat for them. Or, very important, and is going to be very consequential, the American Supreme Court that has outlawed racial preferences in recruiting students. You see, this is very relevant for India, where I mean, I have no real opinion about all this reservation business, but it at any rate has gone too far. What Ambedkar thought of going to be for 10 years, is now unstoppable and everywhere, and a very large percentage and so on. It's a cancer. And so what has happened there in Washington is relevant to India also. And so maybe, it shows a certain trend. And so maybe this whole cancel culture, as a consequence, will also suffer. So, I mean, I'm not that pessimistic. It's just at the moment, we live in interesting times.
So I hope to live and see a time soon where we can have Dr. Anjali's new initiative on Indology or new Indology being taken up formally in universities and under a particular department or something, under a new Indology department through Indic point of view or through native point of view. So I hope to see that happening soon. And then I think we had a very good discussion this evening today. It's nearly an hour. So I'm very thankful to you, Dr. Els, for gracing our platform and discussing in detail about Indology new Indology studies and why it is important and how we should go about it. And Dr. Anjali, thanks a lot for coming and giving us your vision of Indology and new Indology and why should we study new Indology? Why do we need a new discipline of new Indology? Thanks a lot, and
Thank you.
I wish you all the best in your new initiative. And we
Thank you.
hope, and I hope that the universities, the communists, are kind of relegated, and your Indology program really it takes the cake. I mean, people cite your papers that is published in your platform to counter the communists. Thanks a lot.
Thank
Namaste.
you. Nice.
Dr. Els and Anjali, see you
Namaste.
soon in some other
Yes,
platform.
thank you,
Some
Gayatri.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you,
Thanks a
Dr.
lot.
Alex.
Namaste.
Namaste.